Delegates from the Maduro regime met with representatives from the Vichy opposition for another dialogue in Mexico City. The first attempt was 14 months ago, and Chavismo got a major concession from the opposition before abandoning the dialogue. This year, after the US finally caved to repeated requests from the interim government to lift sanctions on the regime and to release Maduro's nephews from a US prison, the regime has come back to the dialogue table. Once again leading the Unitary Platform's delegation was Gerardo Blyde, who had no position in the interim government before being nominated for this responsibility behind closed doors. He was joined by Stalin Gonzalez, who used to be Guaido's second vice president, but who since bent the knee to Maduro and joined the phony 2020 National Assembly. They were joined by Freddy Guevara, the corrupt pipsqueak who used to be part of the legitimate National Assembly, but their mandate expired at the end of 2020, and now Guevara is one of only a few dozen people who still LARP as the legitimate National Assembly, while they meet in private businesses and don't even have a quorum. Leading the Chavista delegation was Jorge Rodriguez, who is currently president of the phony 2020 National Assembly. One interesting and scandalous addition to the Chavista delegation was Camilla Fabri, the wife of Alex Saab, Maduro's Colombian whale of a money launderer who's currently in a US prison. Her presence at the dialogue table is a great big clue for what the regime wants from the opposition, which really means what the regime wants from the US. For a sense of what to expect from the ill-conceived dialogue, we can easily look at the repeated patterns from several other dialogues between the regime and opposition over the last 10 years, starting with the talks in Mexico last year. First, we need to consider the playing field. The talks were held in Mexico, where López Obrador's government recognized Maduro's regime as the Venezuelan government through the entire constitutional crisis. That's not a neutral playing field. Norway moderated the talks, which is another problem because that government recognized Maduro the whole time as well. That's not a neutral arbiter. Next, the Vichy opposition didn't come to the table as the interim government, recognized by dozens of countries as the sovereign government. They came as the Unitary Platform, representing the entire Venezuelan opposition, including the parties and factions that recognize Maduro as president. So right off the bat, the two neutral countries signing the agreements were never neutral. The interim government ceded its sovereignty to join a coalition that includes loyal opposition to Maduro, and several of the opposition delegates already recognized Maduro before they sat down at the table. Next, we look at what last year's talks achieved. Maduro didn't get all his demands, but he got a big win. The opposition parties that had boycotted the regime's fraudulent elections in 2017, 2018, and 2020 agreed to participate in the 2021 regional elections, and each governor candidate had to be approved by the regime's National Election Council. The opposition was unable to get the US to lift sanctions beforehand, but the US did agree to lift sanctions in the future in exchange for free and fair elections. When the US government did not release Alex Saab, the regime walked away from the dialogue. The opposition got nothing in return. These were not peace talks between two disputing factions. They were the interim government's act of surrender to the regime. A month after the pseudo-dialogue, the regime allowed opposition candidates to win 4 governorships while the ruling party awarded itself the other 19 states. Then the federal government stripped control of assets and infrastructure from the state governments, thus neutering the opposition governors. And of course, the governors-elect had to recognize Maduro as president. Now in November 2022, the Vichy opposition got the US to start lifting sanctions. Halliburton and Chevron can operate in Venezuela again, but in order to free Alex Saab, who's Maduro's top money launderer and who knows where the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively, the regime put Alex Saab's wife on the negotiating team. Camilla is a fashion model who became a stay-at-home mom in her 20s and has no diplomatic training. She doesn't know the odds and ends of which electoral races and appointed offices the regime can afford to give to opposition candidates without ceding its monopoly on power. I don't believe Camilla actually has a choice. I think the regime is holding her and her kids hostage to keep her husband from spilling the beans on his operations as a supposed Venezuelan diplomat. Saab has reportedly been talking, but does that mean he gave up Maduro's secret offshore accounts, or just some mid-level guys laundering a few $1 million in Florida? The former would put his family in danger of retaliation, while the latter would give the DOJ some real crime to sink their teeth into, and build himself some standing to make a bargain in the near future, but it wouldn't hurt Maduro. We now know that the official legislative journal supposedly naming Saab as a Venezuelan diplomat that the Colombians' lawyers gave the DOJ is actually fraudulent, since it doesn't match the same issue in the Library of Congress. The document that Saab's lawyers gave was altered later on, so it's likely that Saab's lawyers got him into more trouble. Since Saab's arrest, the regime has repeatedly put his wife in front of the cameras to cry and demand his release and say a bunch of crap about human rights that the chavistas don't actually believe. So it's likely that her one job at the Mexico City talks is to tug on the heartstrings of the pro-Maduro opposition delegates, so that Freddy Guevara then has to tell his fellow party member, Ambassador Carlos Vecchio, to again ask the US government to release Alex Saab. Otherwise, Maduro won't let them run the candidates that they want in the next election. So far, the chavistas and the Vichy opposition have agreed to three main things in the 2022 talks. First, they agreed that they would sit down at the dialogue table that they were currently dialoguing at and have a dialogue. Second, the dialogue should be geared toward agreements for the next presidential election. And third, that the US should unfreeze $5 billion in financial assets that the regime could use for humanitarian purposes. The number that I got directly from one of Guaido's National Assembly members is $3 billion, but Maduro announced $5 billion. That these funds should be returned to the regime for humanitarian projects is hilarious, albeit in the sense of Venezuelan politicians having a cruel, very cruel and cynical sense of humor. Both the Maduro government and the interim government have been galactic black holes where hundreds of millions of dollars at a time go to disappear and never be accounted for again. And once more, they talked absolutely nothing about freeing political prisoners, just money and elections. I see two possibilities for this pseudo-dialogue between Maduro's party and Maduro's loyal opposition. Given the regime's repeated pattern of behavior, the biggest likelihood is that they'll get the opposition to cave on most of Chavismo's demands for the election and agree to ask the US to lift even more sanctions. Here's how that works. The interim government no longer exists constitutionally. They ceded their sovereignty last year to join the Vichy opposition in the unitary platform. But the US still recognizes the interim government. It only exists over here on paper. So, the unitary platform agrees to a laundry list of the regime's demands, then the last remnants of the interim government use official diplomatic channels to request that the US release frozen Venezuelan assets or Maduro's nephews. Then, with no concessions to the opposition, the chavistas will make a big show of walking out on the talks because the US didn't release Alex Saab. The other possibility is that the chavistas bully the opposition into signing a lopsided agreement just so Maduro can have another propaganda win. First, Gustavo Petro recognized Maduro, and the two reopened the Colombia-Venezuela border. Second, Maduro is currently hosting the Colombian peace talks between Petro's government and the ELN guerrillas, both of which are allies to his regime. Third, Maduro got a big win when the US released his nephews and allowed a few oil companies to operate in Venezuela again. Therefore, even with the DOJ not releasing Alex Saab, Maduro has been on a roll lately and he could get another big propaganda win from these talks. And it gets even better for him. With the opposition's signatures on a lopsided agreement, he can give himself a rigged election without the free world sanctioning him. Thank you for watching Venezuela Explained. Please help this channel out by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video on social media.
Por los pueblos dignos del mundo, por Venezuela y por el gobierno legítimos de